Ukraine war live update. Under heavy Russian fire, Ukraine withdraws troops from parts of besieged Kyiv region. You know, when I saw this headline, it startled me in one sense, but it really pointed out the hypocrisy of Western media in another sense. For months, for really years now, they've been purporting things about the war as if everything was rosy. And they reported in a way that it led us to believe, or it led people in the West to believe that things were going good, and it undergirded a lot of the political maneuvering that the administrations in the West were doing to provide aid and to provide some support. But now, in an attempt to save face, Western media is now creating a new narrative. And this new narrative, I think, is still woefully inadequate because a crisis is happening on the battlefield in Ukraine. A crisis is emerging, and it is not just on the battlefield. It's a crisis of the construct, the strategy that has been employed by the West in waging this war against Russia. Russia's assault opens new front, diverting Ukraine forces as Western aid trickles in. While the media is trying to save face, it doesn't really go far enough to really explain to the populations and the people in the West. The truth of the matter is that this thing is crumbling, that there's cracks emerging all around the battlefield in Ukraine, from air defense, from troops on the front line manning fortified positions, from shortages across the board. There is a crisis emerging that no one is truly talking about, and that the media is not putting it into perspective. There's now just barely coming out to try to warm the public up to the possibility that a loss could occur, but they're not hitting the alarm bells in the way that is commensurate with the difficulties that the Ukrainian people are facing on the front line. And my position is this: if the West told Ukraine that they would back them all the way, how can they then go through a process of dithering, a process of uncertainty, a process of just this back and forth on support and the levels of support and the hand wringing and all of this after these people have put their lives on the line? This is an atrocious act. If the West does not step up and honor its commitments. And I'm not for the war. I'm not for any war. I think there's times when war is necessary, but I believe that the first thing must be negotiations. Honest, truthful negotiations, not game playing and maneuvering for more time for military buildup. That would be the ideal situation, is if negotiations could have taken place to avoid this thing. But once the Ukrainian people went to war on the basis of what the Western partners said, then for the Western partners to be ambivalent or to not be forthcoming with aid and support as they promised is an atrocity. Putin heaps praise on Xi while in China. Russia says forces advancing in all directions in Ukraine. Things are not going good. Now, earlier on, you would never see a story like this in the mainstream media. Earlier on, it was just a constant, we're going to win. It's constant. They're shooting down 100% of the projectiles. If you believe that they were shooting down 100% of all aerial projectiles, I don't know what I can do for you. I don't know what can be done for you if you actually believe some of the earlier reports that the media was just reporting without any context, without any attempt to try to make sure that the American people were aware of how their resources, and the Western countries in general, how their resources were being deployed in the battlefield. And the politicians, instead of educating the public as to what was really going on then, now, as well as what the future prospects, because there's never been an articulation of a clear, achievable goal as it pertains to many of the Western countries when they communicate to their populations. And we'll see what the effect of that is as we move through this broadcast. 3 examples of how the Ukraine war is reaching a crisis point. And I would argue that in many cases, it has already reached a crisis point. But I want to give you 3 examples of how a crisis is being reached in different areas of the Ukraine war. The first is aggressive attrition. Now, this notion of aggressive attrition is not one that I created. Aggressive attrition is a term that I'm borrowing, but I think it's appropriate when we realize that long as Russia continues to press, continues to inflict losses, even though they are incurring losses, as long as they continue to inflict losses, this type of attrition, who can last the longest, becomes the nature of the conflict. It's not so much about, we talk so much about territory seized. We talk so much about who's in what city and what tactics are being used for long distance attacks. The reality is that this war will be decided by who gives up first, who can no longer deploy and field an army, who can no longer field equipment on the battlefield. That's what will determine the winners and losers of this conflict. As Russia makes gains, Ukraine needs more soldiers, but expanding the draft is controversial. We have known since the beginning that the Russian army considerably outnumbered the Ukrainian army. Even though in the initial phases of the war, they brought fewer people to the battlefield than was necessary, that lack of personnel could be corrected as long as the war continued. And the longer the war continues, the greater the pressure will be on Ukraine because it has a smaller population than Russia. Not only that, you had lots of men flee the country before the conflict began. And war, while it is a technological endeavor in modern era, at the end of the day, it comes to boots on the grounds. It comes to men in trenches and in foxholes, men manning fortified positions, men making counterattacks and initial attacks and bearing the brunt of all of the human tragedy that is war. You need personnel for that. And if there continues to be a personnel shortage, if this war continues on, and even if Ukraine was losing people at an equal amount to Russia, even if Ukraine was losing people less than Russia was, the casualty rates on Ukraine was less than Russia. The reality is, because of the disparity in population and the disparity on the battlefield, Ukraine still could find itself losing a war, even though it might be winning in casualty counts on the battlefield. And that's the whole notion of aggressive attrition, is who can produce more material and resources, but who can also bring the most numbers to the front for the longest period of time. We're 2 years in. We're going into year 3. This is year 3 of this conflict. What happens in year 4 and in year 5? This is going to be a continued crisis for the Ukraine government. Draft dodging plagues Ukraine as Kyiv faces acute soldier shortage. We talk a lot about draft dodging, but as I mentioned before, there's a lot of the situation that is just people who have left the country. A lot of men left the country. A lot of younger people fled to Europe, and they were welcomed with open arms. Now you see a lot of reports about the Europeans trying to force some of the men to go back and trying to pressure and push them off of aid because they thought that this was a temporary situation. And now they see that this is a long-term support that these individuals will need. And ultimately, how many of them long-term will actually return home when the war is over after being in European capitals for years now? And this thing doesn't seem to have any end immediately in sight. You see this draft dodging they're talking about, and this never was reported earlier on. They only focused on the exuberance of those young people and others who were joining the army, but they never reported on the fact that there were lots of men who refused to join the army then and definitely are not going to join the army when the tide is turning on the battlefield. An early burst of patriotic fervor saw draft centers swamped with volunteers, but that has waned with Vladimir Putin's war in its 3rd year. And it's waned not just because the war is in its third year, it's waned because the people in Ukraine know the truth of what's happening on the front line. And it's not about, I'm not going to cover winning and losing so much in this. I'm talking about the dynamics, the tragedy, the human tragedy. And we're going to cover that in a minute. The tragedy that is occurring in the loss of life, the loss of limbs, the loss of livelihoods and shattered bodies and shattered minds. They are seeing their friends return from the front. Those patriotic men that flooded to the battlefields and into the trenches and fortified positions in Mariupol, and those men who fought in Bakhmut, who have now returned home, some of them in body bags, but others of them who returned home and they're crippled and no longer, they've been transformed by war. They're no longer what their loved ones remembered, not only in body, but in mind. And as you see that, there's going to be more draft dodging. There's going to be more people that say, hey, wait a minute, this is not for me. I'm not going to the eastern part of the country and fight in this Russian-speaking neighborhood to keep this community that has decided it wants to lead. I'm not going there my life is too precious. Even if people believed in it, when they see the human cost, it shakes anyone to their core. It would cause any sane person to tremble at the possibility that could be them. Ukraine needs to draft many more men for a battlefield that is chewing up bodies. But authorities are conflicted over whether to cajole or coerce, and fear of the political fallout if they choose the latter. That's coercion. Since the Russian invasion 2 years ago, around 9,000 draft evasion proceedings have been opened, according to the Ukrainian Interior Ministry. But that's just scratching the surface of the draft dodging and the evasion of registration, so enlistment notices can't be issued. Ultimately, as the horrors of war are moved closer to home, there are going to be those who, even though they are patriotic, even though they may agree with what the country is doing, they see the contours of this conflict and they wonder whether their life will actually make a difference on the battlefield. It's one thing when you're winning. It's one thing when you're pressing the case and you're holding and you're inflicting disproportionate casualties on the enemy. But to ask young men to risk their lives, to ask young women now to risk their lives on the front line, it's a difficult sell. And the administration, the Ukrainian administration, has to determine if they want to win this war, they're going to have to cajole and coerce. And they're going to have to be able to weather the political storms. Otherwise, what you see is a continuation. And this is not about whether the war should be fought or not. This is about the strategic decisions that the West and Ukraine and others are making that are creating a crisis. Some of it is just built in because of the population difference between the two, but other parts of it is because of the dithering that is taking place across the Western allies and even in the administration in Ukraine. There is a need for more men. A draft must be called. If you're going to fight to win. If you're going to fight this thing in a way that will lead to victory. But what they're doing is this trying to politically, and then they're sending out people to round up folks on the streets. We've seen these things on social media where they've got these vans grabbing young men off of the street and pushing them to the battlefield. One, that's not the type of soldier that you want on the front line, because soon as they get the opportunity to surrender, they will. Two, how is this soldier, this young person that you've hurled into the back of a van, going to receive their training and equip themselves? And then three, not only could you possibly have an ineffective soldier on the front line, but you're also draining the labor force to fuel the economy, which is underpinning this whole military endeavor. They're serious. This is a crisis that they have to figure out. And part of it can't be figured out in that when you look at this chart, fighting age male population in Ukraine and Russia. The yellow line is Russia. The blue line is Ukraine. And anyone looking at this line is clear that there's a problem between the difference in population, especially when it comes to males 18 to 40. The Ukraine, even if they were inflicting casualties at the same rate as the Russians, cannot engage in a prolonged conflict because of the population imbalance. They would have to draw population from somewhere else. And this does not take into consideration the draft dodging. This doesn't take into consideration all of the people who have fled to other countries. It doesn't take any of those things into consideration. Now, earlier on, the time to really press the negotiations when Russia was on the back foot, and when Russia had too few men for the mission that they had tried to achieve. That was the time to bloody Russia's nose and then run to the negotiation table. But if you prolong the conflict, if you believe that you're going to get back, remember when the media was telling us that the offensive was coming and that they would be able to secure Crimea and that they would take back all of the land? Do you remember all of those stories and reports in the mainstream media? All of them turned out to be hogwash, total nonsense, because the longer the war continues, the more there's going to be a realization or a pressure on the human capital necessary to man the front line. Look at this from an equipment standpoint, and we're getting ready to talk about the aid packages, because we can't talk about the crisis without talking about the crisis in aid. But look at where they started. When you look at military personnel, the top row is the Ukrainian army, the bottom row is the Russian army. Military personnel, look at that imbalance. Tanks, look at the imbalance. Ships, nuclear capabilities, and then look at military expenditures. Look at this this indifference between the two. The longer the war goes on, either when it comes to equipment, that gap will have to be filled by Western partners in order for them to stand up on the battlefield. And when it comes to personnel, while France is talking about bringing in troops and they're open to the idea of it, the Western allies by and large are saying they're not going to send large-scale troops in. And I did a video not too long ago, go back and watch it, about NATO alarm bells ringing and the fact that in order for this to be a long-term conflict, troops will have to come from somewhere. You cannot continue this nature of attrition on the battlefield. The imbalance, even if you were to believe all of the reports coming out of Ukraine, that there's an imbalance, that they are inflicting far more casualties on the Russians than the Russians on Ukraine, because of the population imbalance, that's not enough. The longer this thing continues, there's going to have to be an influx of military personnel, not just from within Ukraine, but from abroad. Look at the imbalance in hardware, military hardware, aircraft, attacking helicopters, mobile rocket launchers, tanks, armored vehicles. Is the West prepared to not only bring Ukraine up to par so that it can engage Russia, but is the West even prepared to continue this over the long haul? And that's been one of the perennial issues in this war. There has been a Western aid disaster taking place. And by disaster, I'm talking about the decision-making process in the distribution of aid. These people in Ukraine went to war with the assurance that they could depend on the West to provide them with whatever equipment they needed on the battlefield. And the truth of the matter is, while the West has provided extraordinary amounts of equipment to Ukraine, that equipment has been spotty, it has been intermittent, it has constantly come with restrictions, it has constantly come with limitations as to what would be provided initially, and then over time, a trickling in or a realization in the West that the requests that Ukraine was making ended up turning out to be accurate requests. We were told, oh, they don't need that, they're just asking for it. That's how the Western media constantly reported the requests from Ukraine. And then later on, a couple months, all of a sudden you see the things that we said they didn't need all of a sudden being provided. This has been a disastrous policy of equipment transfers to Ukraine. Delays in promised Western military aid to Ukraine are costing lives that they don't have to give. You see, we just talked about it, this aggressive attrition. They cannot afford to lose men because they don't have artillery shells. They can't afford to lose people because they don't have tanks or infantry fighting vehicles. They don't have HIMARS and long-range systems. They don't have air defense systems and Patriot missile batteries. They can't afford it because they're already at a population disadvantage. The defense minister says, look at this. This is a catastrophe. This is a crisis that is a strategic crisis that is turning into a battlefield crisis, but it really started in the boardrooms and in the halls of power in the United States and throughout the European Union. Nearly out of time, White House issues dire warning to Congress about stalled Ukraine aid. This is not a way to run a railroad. These Ukrainians, and you know, I'm not here today to talk about the validity of the war, which side you're on. I'm here to talk about we are human beings. We are creatures of passion, of love, of humanity. And when we see these people paying the ultimate price, regardless of whether you support the war or you're against the war, something has to turn down inside you and say, my goodness, something has to move within you to have a measure of decency and compassion for the thousands, hundreds of thousands of people whose lives are being transformed, and to know that they went into this conflict on the basis of a promise from the West. And the West has not lived up to the obligations and in many instances chastised. Now, I'm not a Zelensky fan. If you've watched any of my videos, I'm not a Zelensky fan. I'm not a fan of any of the Davos crowd. I think the elites oftentimes go into these conflicts without any real understanding of the human cost that it will place on the middle class and the poor class and those who are the outcasts of society, and how their lives are not going to be changed really in any way. You know, many of these people who are fighting and who are being wounded in battle on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, when the war is over, their lives will not be transformed in any way other than the hardship and the wounds that they incurred on the battlefield. The Davos crowd, the elites, lives may be improved in one way or another, but the common man in most of these conflicts ends up worse off each and every time. And if you were to go into war with a promise and then get into the war, and then sometimes you get equipment and sometimes you don't, they already know there's a population imbalance. They already know there's an equipment imbalance. But to have this back and forth, we're going to send help, we're not going to send help. We'll send help here. The politics can't, politics can't decide everything when promises have been made. And in the West, it's showing, or it's seeming like politics is deciding what Ukraine will get. And if they had been told that it would be like this, I wonder if they would have made the same decision to depend on the West in this way. And part of the problem is you have to understand Western society. The narrative that the media spins up can only hold for so long against the overwhelming presence of truth and facts. And as the narrative has crumbled and the media, to save face, has started to report the truth about the contours of this conflict, the imbalances in military capacity, production capacity, we were told that Russia would run out of everything. They would run out of everything. But then when you see that, Russia will be isolated, that's what they told us. And when it didn't happen and the media saw that it wasn't happening, they had to start moving away from propaganda and spin and slowly try to recover their credibility by putting out the truth. And as the truth is slowly trickling, you see a shift in the population. Look at this chart here. Republicans and Democrats widely differ on aid to Ukraine. And I think the article really misses, the whole piece really misses the true alarm bells within this data. Look at the Republicans right here in the middle with the Republican/lean Republican. It started off with 9% support, or too much. There's too much weaponry and too much support, too much aid going to Ukraine. By the time we get to April 24, that number has jumped to 49% of Republicans say we're doing too much for Ukraine. And when you look at the other side of it, it's 49% who are against it, but there's only 34% who say that it's about right or not enough. That means there's a huge percentage of people out there who are totally ambivalent about these aid packages. That's alarming. It's not about how many, it's about the trajectory and trend. And as the reports on the battlefield seem like things are not going well, more and more people are going to say, what's the plan here? What's the goal here? What was the long-term strategy beyond let's weaken Russia? How are we going to win this thing? You know, in America, people want to win. And that's everywhere. No one wants to be supporting the losing side of anything. And so the people are questioning, hey, is there a plan other than more of the same? Because more of the same we see is not working. Even amongst Democrats, while the support for the war is much higher because the Biden administration is the champion for this cause, the reality is the trajectory. It started out with 5% saying it's too much, and it's moved all the way up to 16%. When you look at the population as a whole, we started off with just 7% against. Now it's gotten up to 31% against this. The trajectory is the problem. It's not about Republican or Democrat. The problem is that the public as a whole is softening on their support for the war. And as that begins to become a preeminent a factor in American politics going into a national election cycle, it is going to become more difficult to approve these aid packages. And that's the problem. They need the aid on the front line. And if this is your supporters, you're in terrible situation. This is a crisis situation. And it's not just the United States. The rest of the world wants the Ukraine war to go away. Putin has other ideas. Think about it. War fatigue is something that is real. And populations around the world, when they see the things that are going on in their community, when they see the fact that they don't have sometimes the resources that they need to live life, that when they have pressures, and then they see their governments month after month sending hundreds of billions of dollars overseas, and then finally when the reports hit that the war is not going well, they ask themselves, what am I suffering for? If we're not going to win, why are we sending these funds? Let's negotiate our way out of this and use our resources at home. That's how people think. And it's not bad. It's just, doesn't matter which side of the world. It doesn't matter whether it's on the Russian side or whether it's on the Western side. If you see that things on the battlefield are going bad, and you see your life being difficult, and you see your country pouring money into a conflict, you're going to start asking some questions. What about me? And we see this all the time. This is no different from any other military conflict. And so I don't know why the Western administration seems so blindsided by the shift in public sentiment as it relates to this conflict. U.S. military aid to Ukraine was poorly tracked, Pentagon report says. And then this compounds it. It's not just that the battlefield issues are difficult. It's not just that domestic economic issues are difficult. And I'm not talking about the stock market, because every time you talk about American economics or Western economics, the elites point towards the stock market and GDP. I'm talking about prices in the grocery store. I'm talking about families putting food on the table. I'm talking about their ability to put gas in their car and to feel secure in their job and their direction on as it pertains to their financial future. Can I retire in a couple years? Is the economy going to be bad? Can I put my kids in college or university? That's how they measure the economy, not how the elites or the Davos crowd measure it by their portfolios and the stock market's up, so the economy's great. No, the average person measures it by, can they buy a house with interest rates so high? Can they afford for their kids to move out on their own and get them a car while car prices are high? Are they able to pay off their credit card at the end of the month? That's how they measure the economy. And U.S. military aid to Ukraine was poorly tracked. And when they see this headline, wait a minute, you mean to tell me not only are we bearing the brunt of the economic turmoil around the world, we're okaying we're holding on while you're giving aid to this cause, and those even who think it's a worthy cause still are going to have second guesses when they see that the aid is being distributed in a way where there's little oversight and where much of it is unaccounted for. And the other piece of the aid package and this aid crisis that we see is that all of the aid is not military aid. And people, I don't think, really realize that you're trying to close a gap on the battlefield. And these aid packages are broken up into three categories. The three categories of the aid package, for the most part, you have the humanitarian category, you have the budget support category, and then you have the weapons and equipment. The humanitarian category is the money used to help those who are in need in Ukraine. But the budget category is to support the Ukrainian government as the factories are being bombed out, as the tax base is eroding because people are leaving, going to different places, as there's a general crisis in the economic footprint, as they're having difficulty exporting their agricultural products and other things that help to support the country. There's a need to pay firemen. There's a need to pay policemen. There's need to pay civil servants, to pay the people who are fighting on the front line. So a large portion of these aid package has nothing to do with military. It has to do with just supporting the actual government of Ukraine so that it can continue to operate and function. The teachers have to be paid. The sanitation workers have to continue. The public works workers have to have salaries in order to keep the country running, in order to keep this effort going. And that's a large portion of the aid package. The other portion is in military equipment. But the military equipment oftentimes is not the way people think it is. They think that we are giving them money and that the Ukrainian government is then taking that money and buying the most advanced equipment at the best price that they need, that they can get in order to supply or to address the needs on the battlefield. When in actuality, what's really happening with the equipment is that the money is being given to Western companies. Old equipment, old stockpiles are being shipped to Ukraine, and that the stockpiles, the hole in the stockpile is being replaced with newer equipment. So the best of what the West has to offer is not being sent to Ukraine. Yes, we hear of Abrams tanks, and those tanks were more advanced than the tanks that they had been using, but those tanks were not the most current generation of main battle tanks that the United States had to send. They sent them something and then used the money, these aid packages, to replace those items in the stockpile. And so while yes, it is providing, but what is the nature of what they're providing? Biden emphasizes that majority of Ukraine aid package would be spent in U.S. So we think of it as we're equipping them with all they need to fight and with all they need to achieve victory on the battlefield. But then when we look down deep into what is actually being done, we see that, yes, we're equipping them, but we're not equipping them with cutting edge stuff. And the money we talk about in these aid bills is just to fill stockpile holes from sending them old stuff that we no longer use or even in some instances would use on the modern battlefield. Some of the stuff that is being sent to Ukraine would not be used by the United States military or Western militaries on the modern battlefield because it has been deemed to be too outdated. It has been deemed to be too dangerous to emerge on the battlefield with such equipment. And yes, it's more than what they had, but is this what Ukraine was promised when this thing began? That's the sad thing. Is this what they thought would happen when this thing started off? Is this the notion of what they believed would transpire as the war continued, that they'd be given older stuff, outdated stuff, and be forced to put those into use on the battlefield? Yes, it's better than nothing, but the question is, if you're a young man sitting at home in Kyiv, if you're a young man in Kharkiv trying to decide whether you're going to join up with the army or you're going to be a draft dodger, when you see the equipment and you realize that this is not the cutting edge stuff, when you see the artillery men on TV saying, oh, we only fire a few shells a day because we just don't have the artillery, do you decide that you want to go and be in the trenches under constant Russian bombardment and assault? There's no reason for us to look down on these people, but because if you were in their position, what decision would you make? And nobody knows until they're in that position. Look at this. This is one of the big problems here. When you look at the aid, there's three categories: military, financial, and humanitarian. Look how little humanitarian aid is being given. Look at the military aid is primarily being given by the United States. And that's why I constantly, in this particular segment, focused on the aid that's being given, because so much of it is being given by the United States. And that's why I've been focusing on U.S. aid, but it's also UK and Germany. But the problem is production capacity to replace or to fill the holes in the stockpile does not seem to be there in the West. And so while they're giving what they can, they're still trying to hold on, because especially the United States, they've got hot spots all over the world. In the Middle East, they've got a hot spot. They're pressuring China and preparing for the possibility of a confrontation there. So their stockpiles, yes, do need to be refilled, but that's not what's going on in the minds of people when they see the report that aid is being given. They don't think that, oh, the aid has already gone out, we're just buying stuff to fill up the stockpile again. And look at all of the other countries that, you see all of these countries that are talking. Many of them don't have the capacity to back up that talk. They're depending heavily on 3 or 4 countries to provide the equipment and the military equipment to Ukraine. And that's not a sustainable situation, especially as United States and the United Kingdom are moving towards elections. And as the stuff looks bad on the battlefield and you move towards elections, these aid packages are going to be much harder to pass, even though the full impact of the money being spent is not military in nature. It's still necessity for them to continue on. But there's one more crisis I want to talk about today. There's one more crisis that I feel that the media has completely and totally, for the most part, stopped truly reporting on. We report on who's winning on the front line, and I don't want to really talk about that today. There's lots of people out there who do mapping, and I implore you to go out and look at that. There's lots of people out there who talk about this particular piece of equipment or that particular piece of equipment. But the crisis that I want to talk about is a human cost, the human crisis. When we look at war and what it has done to neighborhoods and communities throughout Russia, but mainly in Ukraine, not very much in Russia, maybe the Belgorod region and other places where there have been attacks. But this is what vibrant communities once looked like, where kids played and families enjoyed holiday meals, where life was experienced. This is what war actually looks like. And there's a human cost to that is not being reported by the media, that it's a crisis. There is a crisis going on. And whenever we talk about negotiations, there seems to be this negotiations is a bad word. Negotiations is resolution, political is always seen as weakness or a bad word in the West. Only answer is war and winning on the battlefield. But where do we take a moment? When do we take a moment and realize that, hey, there is a human cost to what is going on? And that human cost is a tragedy, a tragedy. Ukraine updates. UN decries horrific human cost of war. The United Nations says Russia's war in Ukraine has inflicted immense suffering that will echo through the generations. A whole generation of young men, a whole generation of young women are being impacted by this conflict, not just in Ukraine, but also in Russia. These young people, many of them didn't want to fight, but they had to do their duty, and they went to the front, and they returned maimed. They returned shattered. And it's not just the military personnel that is suffering, it's the civilian populations that are suffering. The infrastructure is being destroyed. The energy, and Ukraine had one of the most vibrant energy infrastructures in Europe, and it has been decimated. It will take a generation just to get back to where they were when the war first began. And I listened to some of the stuff and some of the reports of Boris Johnson and some of the other leaders who were in the early negotiations, and how they were so glib in their response to concessions and negotiations and security concerns. They felt like it would be a good thing to constantly maneuver throughout those negotiations. And I'm not blaming them for the failure of negotiations. I'm blaming all sides for the failure of negotiations, because at the end of the day, the people who suffer are not the elite. More than 14 million people fled homes in Ukraine since Russia invasion. This is shocking. 14 million people, some of them ended up in the western part of the country. Some of them ended up in distant places where they now are refugees dependent upon government. These were proud people, business owners, mothers, grandparents. These were people who had lives and who were successful, many of them. And now to find themselves at the bottom of the economic totem pole in a foreign land is the human crisis that is war. And they can't go back. Those people who lived in the East and who lived in different cities, how can they go back to Avdiivka? How can they go back to Mariupol? How can they go back to the lands that were destroyed? Those communities and the fabrics of them have been irrevocably destroyed. Never again. Our community is not just the people. It is the people, but it is also the places, the local grocery store that we've been going 20 years, the local restaurant. I'm a creature of habit. I go to the same restaurants and order the same food, sit in the same booth. What happens to your world when those places no longer exist? The landmarks that we attach to our life, that we become comforting to us in our existence, that we not only help to stabilize and create, but that they help to stabilize and create a world for us. Those are gone. Millions of Ukrainians face mounting massive debt burden. What would happen to you if you had to pull up all your stuff and move across country and go to a foreign country and try to find housing? Would you have the money to do it? Most people don't. Most people don't have the money to relocate on a whim. And so they use credit. They borrow money. They use credit cards. They borrow against their house if they still have a house to borrow against. And they try to do the best they can to save their lives, realizing that material things all pass away and that life is so precious. But that in and of itself is a crisis for a country, and is a crisis for a people. The fact that the places that they once called home are no longer, and probably in many instances will never be available to them again. They've got to go to a new place and start from scratch and build a new life. And that is something that we rarely hear reported. We rarely hear the stories of the hardship of this. When we talk about war, regardless of what side you're on, regardless of I'm talking beyond Ukraine. Let's move beyond Ukraine. When we talk about conflict in the West, oftentimes we minimize the human suffering of those civilians. We minimize the human suffering even of the military men who are engaged in the conflict itself. In the West, we ask young men and young women to go off to fight, to die, to be maimed and wounded. And when they get home, the support network for them is inadequate, such that we have a whole phenomena of veterans sleeping on the streets, homeless. a phenomenon of veterans, people who have fought and served this country well, served their country well, whether it's UK or whether it's Germany or whether it's the United States or wherever you are, Canada, to come home and to find yourself not able to find a job, your body broken, your mind broken, and the healthcare system, the veterans healthcare system to be woefully inadequate to meet the needs that you have, the wait list and the dehumanizing conditions that are faced. It is amazing. And not to mention, one of the things that we don't talk about is the environmental impact. That yes, you're not only losing a generation of people, but the environmental impact. These cluster munitions that at one point was banned by the world as a munition akin to, weapons of mass destruction. It was akin to chemical warfare. It was a no-no. They're being used all over Russia. And these bomblets that disperse don't always explode. And so for, years and years, that you will be having people walking through fields thinking that they're just enjoying the springtime breeze. And all of a sudden they'll step on a bomblet and lose a limb. And if not, lose their life. This will go on for decades and decades. We're still finding unexploded munitions from previous wars, World War II and other previous wars. Don't you know that this is going to be the reality throughout Ukraine, especially with these cluster munitions that are so popular now? I remember when they first started talking about their use in Ukraine, the media was against it and everybody talked about the horrors of this munition, but now it's almost celebrated. Like the munitions are somehow less horrible as the situation on the battlefield erodes. It doesn't matter which side is up or down. Long term, these munitions will be killing people for decades to come. Even when the war is over, there still will be casualties, and as a result of some of the munitions that are being used in Ukraine. War is terrible. And anyone who tells you that there should not be consistent negotiations, even if there's not a resolution, but the fact that the parties are talking and that pressure is being applied to find a resolution, those people don't realize, they don't care about the human cost of this thing. There is a human cost to war that should appall all of us, should make us all step back and say, what are we doing? To make us all feel like negotiations and the effort made at true resolution should be the goal. It shouldn't be to weaken a country. When I heard the Lloyd Austin get up and say, our goal here is to weaken Russia. But you're doing it with Ukrainian lives. You're doing it with sons and husbands, fathers of real people. If that's your goal, you strap on your boots and you go over there and do it. Why would that be the goal? The goal should be to have a strong, independent Ukraine that is viable and at peace with its neighbors, such that the neighbors don't feel like it's a threat and such that it can choose its own economic and military and political future, that it can have defense assurances, whether it's in NATO or out of NATO. That should be the goal. The goal shouldn't be to weaken Russia with Ukrainian lives, because yes, you're weakening Russia, but at what cost to this intermediary that you're using as a tool for your own purposes? Yes, they have passions for independence and nationalism, like every person or every country on the planet. But should that passion for national sovereignty and that passion for nationalism be manipulated by Western powers for their own goals and objectives? The goal and objective of weakening Russia, that to me does not seem like a goal and objective worth the lives of a third party. And if it's that third party that desires to defend itself, by all means, defend yourself. But the United States saying that that's the goal, it looks beyond the human cost of this conflict and war. And that's the part that I wanted to do on this broadcast, is to talk to you about this crisis. There is a human cost. And yes, it exists on the Russian side, and it exists on the Ukrainian side, and I deplore war, and I'm not for any of this war, and I'm not here to talk about the justifications for why Ukraine and Russia are engaged in the war, but I am going to talk about the justifications that the United States has used as it pertains to this war. And the fact of the matter is, if you're trying to help Ukraine, do what's in the best interest of Ukraine. And if providing military aid is that, then do it. But this half-cocked, cockamamie scheme that they're doing where we're not going to give them fighter jets. And then we say, oh, wow, they need fighter jets. We're not going to send them long-range rockets. Oh, wow, they need we're not going to send them air defense. Oh, wow, they need it. If you're going to do it, do it. And do it with some measure of integrity and take it to the people and sell it. And if you win the election, win. If you lose, lose with honor, saying you did the right thing. But this back and forth, this constant teetering and we're in and we're out, and not thinking about all of this at the beginning. That's the real crisis. It's a crisis of vision and strategy. The Western powers did not think about this at the beginning. What would happen if this war drags on? What would happen? When they were backing Ukraine in the negotiation, they should have been talking about what a 3-year, a 4-year, a 5-year, a 10-year war looks like. Because the reality is many of the wars that have been fought were not resolved in a year or two. They went on for, some decades. And so that's the situation that we're in. But why was that not the discussion at the beginning? We are in a crisis, and only time will tell how they get out of this, how they can ramp up aid, how they can resolve it through negotiations. And at this point, because they pushed it so far, negotiations don't seem to be on the table on either side, Russia or Ukraine. And so now you're locked into what could be what will be a continued tragedy for humanity, a continued tragedy of loss of life. A continued tragedy, locked in. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We are locked into a tragedy here where we can't seem to find our way out of this maze, either on the Western side or on the Russian side. And it's going to require leadership, but unfortunately, it may require even more death and catastrophe on the battlefield before either side comes to a point where they're ready to settle this conflict. As always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and follow. Stay tuned because the video is coming up next right here on this broadcast to help inform us about things in the world as well as the Russian economy in relation to sanctions. Want to thank you for watching. Ask you to like, follow, and to share our content so that we can grow the platform. Why swim against the current when you can ride the wave? Don't play the victim, play the game.
Have you ever wondered how the Russian economy has demonstrated such resiliency in the face of severe international sanctions? This intrigue has puzzled economists, political experts, and policymakers. The question has become increasingly critical as sanctions have escalated over time. The genesis of this curiosity comes from the Ukraine war aftermath, which significantly altered the global political scene and plunged Russia into direct conflict with the West. Post this conflict, Russia found itself targeted by several comprehensive economic sanctions. The world anticipated the Russian economy to buckle under this pressure. Contrarily, the economy proved remarkably resilient, shocking observers worldwide. The sanctions undeniably had a substantial impact, especially on sectors like aviation and car manufacturing, heavily dependent on Western inputs. Their struggles were quite visible and well accounted for. Yet, the overall shrinkage of the Russian economy was less drastic than initially expected, leading many to question the sanctions' efficacy. In 2023, the International Monetary Fund revised its initial prediction of a 2.8% contraction of the Russian GDP to 1.1%, signifying the surprising resilience of the Russian economy. Resilience was due to several crucial factors. Firstly, the Russian government and the central bank swiftly responded to the sanctions. They executed measures like capital flow restrictions, interest rate increase, and significant domestic industry support, which helped stabilize the ruble and reassure investors. Secondly, Russia strategically shifted its economic priorities towards defense spending and promoting domestic industries to lessen Western goods dependence. This shift remarkably insulated the economy from the worst impacts of the sanctions. Thirdly, despite the rhetoric and actions against it, Russia's energy exports, particularly its oil and gas sales to countries like China and India, continued at a substantial level. These sales produced significant revenue and maintained a positive current account surplus, providing much-needed funds in a time of revenue shortfall. Lastly, the sanctions regime's effectiveness was mitigated by factors like enforcement loopholes that enabled some transactions to bypass the sanctions and the hesitance of some firms to entirely cease business with Russia. These factors combined to form a unique blend of resilience and adaptability that kept the Russian economy afloat during this challenging period. Recently, the European Union expanded its sanctions list by adding 27 entities, including companies from China, India, and Iran, accused of being connected to Russia's defense sector or facilitating the purchase of Russian oil and gas. This recent expansion of the sanctions is a pivotal part of the ongoing geopolitical chess game playing out on the international stage. It brings into sharp focus the complex web of economic and political relationships that are under stress due to escalating tensions between the European Union and Russia. At the core of this issue is a struggle for control over crucial resources, specifically the oil and gas industry, which is the economic lifeblood of numerous nations worldwide. The decision of the European Union to expand the sanctions by adding these entities, which represent a diverse selection of companies from various regions including Asia and the Middle East, has made a bold statement. The EU's move has been an eyebrow-raising development, igniting discussions and debates around the globe. The inclusion of these organizations on the sanctions list is a significant step taken by the European Union, which sends a strong message. It communicates to global nations and corporations that any assistance, either direct or indirect, for Russia's defense sector or oil and gas trade is not going to be overlooked. It also indicates the EU's firm stance against any perceived support for Russia's military sector. The sanctions list, which was already notably extensive, has now expanded further. This enlargement exemplifies the relentless efforts of the European Union to exert and increase pressure on Russia. The underlying objective of this pressure campaign is to curtail Russia's ability to finance its war efforts. Through these sanctions, the EU aims to cut off the financial lifelines that enable Russia to sustain its military campaigns. The sanctions are a strategic instrument of economic warfare, specifically designed to destabilize Russia's economy and undermine its capability to carry out military operations. In parallel with these developments, the situation in the United Kingdom adds another layer to this increasingly complex issue. The UK's Treasury Committee has launched its own probe into the effectiveness of their sanctions regime against Russia. This investigation is a deeply serious initiative, meticulously designed to evaluate the impact of existing sanctions and scrutinize their effectiveness. It is also geared towards identifying any potential loopholes in the sanctions regime. Through a deep dive into the nuances of the current sanctions, the Treasury Committee aims to produce evaluation. Furthermore, the committee will also consider broadening their scope to include buyers of Russian oil and gas. This is a clear indication that the UK is considering a more aggressive stance against Russia. The potential targeting of buyers could dramatically change the landscape of the trade of Russian oil and gas in the global market. The committee has also resolved to explore an additional powerful weapon in the arsenal of economic warfare, the possibility of confiscating frozen Russian assets. These assets are currently frozen under existing sanctions and could be seized in a bid to inflict further damage on Russia's economy. The unexpected resilience of the Russian economy amidst international sanctions unveils a multifaceted landscape. This scenario, which has left many economists, policymakers, and experts puzzled, is notable not just for the sheer resilience, but also for the tenacity and robustness with which the Russian economy is enduring the global economic storm. As we venture deeper into this intriguing mystery, numerous factors begin to emerge. To start with, the Russian economy has demonstrated hints of a certain level of self-reliance, particularly in critical sectors like agriculture. With the sanctions in place, Russia was forced to rely more on its domestic capacities, resulting in an unexpected acceleration in its domestic production capabilities. Surprisingly, the repercussions were an uplift in multiple sectors, leading to a diversification in the economy that goes beyond the traditional energy-focused model. In addition, Russia has been successful in evading the sanctions by leveraging alternative channels and forging new partnerships. Bonds with nations such as China, India, and other key players in the Asian market have been reinforced. alliances have become Russia's lifeline, enabling it to sustain its economic activities regardless of the limitations imposed by Western nations. However, it's essential to note that this resilience doesn't provide a full picture of the Russian economy. Despite the seeming economic power, there are prevailing issues. Inflation rates have soared, the ruble's value has plummeted, and the standard of living for some Russians has worsened. Still, the economy carries on, albeit marred with an undertone of uncertainty and instability. This extraordinary resilience sparks a deep question about the efficacy of sanctions as a tool in the geopolitical sphere. Sanctions are fundamentally designed to apply pressure, induce behavioral change, or serve as punishment. However, in Russia's case, they seem to have had an unintended, somewhat counterproductive effect. This prompts a reevaluation of the usefulness of these measures, their execution, and their unexpected repercussions. Enhanced diplomatic engagement and negotiation could potentially serve as a more effective approach. Such a strategy would emphasize the significance of dialogue and reciprocal respect in addressing geopolitical disputes. The world throws a lot our way financially these days. From war and conflict shaping global markets to local news headlines impacting your grocery bill, it can feel like there's no escaping the constant financial juggling act. But here's the secret weapon you might not know you have: knowledge. With the right understanding of how these complex economic forces work, you can navigate the uncertainties and make informed decisions that benefit your wallet. Unlock your financial power. Like this video to stay in the loop about the latest financial insights. Follow our channel for even deeper dives into money matters. Share this program with someone who could benefit from building their financial future. Remember, knowledge is power. Let's build a stronger financial future together.